Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Civics. And today we're going to finish up our talk of the main part of the Constitution by talking about Articles 4, 5, 6, and 7. The first three articles really kind of laid out how the government structure is going to work, and these articles afterwards talk more about um, how the states have to interact with each other, what's the hierarchy of how our government's going to work, and what we can do to amend this new document. So let's get started. Article 4 is about state relationships. So what can the states do with each other? And so the main takeaway from this article is that states must extend full faith and credit to other state laws. So that means that, let's say you live in Illinois and you have a driver's license from Illinois and you get pulled over in Iowa. Iowa can't say, well, you don't have an Iowa driver's license, so we can charge you for that. Instead, they have to extend the full faith that Illinois has tested you, and knows that you're capable of driving to give you a driver's license. So that's the kind of main takeaway from this article. There are a few other things though. The other couple things in Article 4 kind of talk about how citizens from other states have to be respected. There is a clause in there that talks about how states must return fugitives to their state, and now that's been interpreted in several ways. One, that means if you do a crime in Illinois and you run away to another state, right, then that state, if they catch you, they need to bring you back to the state where you committed a crime. However, this is also interpreted as the founders' way of saying that if a slave runs away from the South and tries to get to the North, that the northern states have an obligation to return those slaves back to the South. So in the Constitution, they don't really mention slavery directly very often, but this is one instance where it is hinted at. But that's what they meant. They were talking about slaves running away from their owners. It also establishes that Congress is the only body that is allowed to admit new states. So if a new territory wanted to become a state, it had to ask Congress for permission to join. And so every state that's added since the first 13 had to go through a Congress. And some states have even been denied entry and then had to try again because they didn't meet Congress's requirements. And if you know anything about American history, states joining the Union actually became a huge sticking point, because some states were slave states and some states weren't. And so that argument really led to what ended up becoming the Civil War. So that's a power that's really important. Congress also has power over federal lands. So if the federal government ends up owning land, which now it owns a lot of land, Congress has control over that, not the states that it resides in. So like all of the national parks, those are technically administered by Congress, not by the states that they settle in. And then finally, it also says at the end that each state must have a Republican form of government. So that means that each state has to have some sort of representative government involved in it. And if it doesn't, Congress can step in and make that happen. So if they don't think that promise has been fulfilled, the federal government has the ability to fix that. Article 5. Article 5 is about how we amend the Constitution, and it's not as cutthroat as in the Articles of Confederation. Remember when every single state had to agree? Now it's a little bit different. So amendments to be proposed, either 2/3 of Congress or 2/3 of state legislatures have to approve an amendment. There's actually several amendments that are in the approval process right now. Some of them have been in that process since like the 1700s. So like that does happen. It's still happening now. People try to propose amendments, not all the time, but it does happen. It just doesn't get as much press because they don't usually ever actually get to the point where they're passed. And then after that, to pass the amendment, 3/4 of the states have to agree to follow that amendment. So at this point, for 3/4 of the states, that's 37 or 38, I think. Yeah, 38, because it's got to be over 3/4. So instead of 37.5, it's 38. So 38 states have to approve that new amendment. There is no deadline on this process. So you could start an amendment in 1787 when the Constitution came into effect. And as long as it gets approved by 3/4 of the states at any point, it can become an amendment. So there's no deadline on that. Article 6. Article 6 is about what's called the federal supremacy. And basically what it means is that the federal law is the supreme law of the land. That means that all federal law trumps state laws. So if a state passes a law, the federal government passes a law that contradicts that state law, the federal law wins because the federal law is the supreme law of the land. It also says that there's no religious test for offices. So the government can't say, oh, I'm sorry, you're not Catholic, so can't be part of the government. That's not allowed. So you can't impose some sort of religious test or some test of faith to join the government. Although not like directly, but there are kind of tests of faith within government. It's really hard for people who aren't of the general religious background to get elected in a lot of places because many Americans won't vote for people who aren't, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So that's kind of like a religious test, but it's not like mandated, so that doesn't get covered under this. And then finally, Article 6, this is one of the really big controversial parts of the Constitution. It says that all debts that were in the hands of the states, so each state's debt is going to be absorbed by the federal government. So Article 6 creates the national debt. And so it means that instead of each state having to worry about the debts that it had incurred, the national government would just take it over. And so that was a big sticking point even back then because some states were debt-free and others had huge, huge debts. And so those states that didn't have any debt were worried/upset that now their tax dollars had to deal with other people's issues and debts. And even now that's still kind of an issue. People get all frustrated and upset about their tax dollars going to things that they don't think we should be putting money into. So that hasn't changed, obviously. And then finally, Article 7 is how the Constitution will be ratified. So remember, the Constitution was supposed to be an amendment. And so all the states were supposed to say, yes, we agree to this. But in Article 7, it says that only 9 of the 13 original colonies had to approve this Constitution instead of all 13. And like I said earlier in an earlier episode, there was this huge fight, political battle, to get this ratified and get it to happen. And a lot of those things are going to end up, one of the things that ended up getting it ratified, we're going to talk about in the next episode, which is called the Bill of Rights. But, fighting to get 9 states to ratify was a huge deal. Back when that ratification was happening, there was a big worry that New York wasn't going to ratify it. New York at the time was like the biggest state. And so if New York didn't ratify, they were afraid that other states weren't going to. So there was a large push to get New York to ratify. Because if New York didn't, then none of the other states would follow through and this whole thing would collapse. So that whole process is a whole other historical story, which maybe will pop up in one of my other series, putting the story in history later on. But as far as the government goes, just remember that this wasn't exactly following the rules of the time. They are making their own rules in this convention. So like I said, next episode is going to be about the Bill of Rights. That'll be the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that were passed literally in like the next year after it was ratified. Like it was immediate, and it was part of the deal to get the Constitution ratified. So can't wait to see you then. Excited to talk about the Bill of Rights. Have a good day.